Days Gone at its surface may just come off as yet another open world zombie video game, a type of entertainment the world of gaming has seen quite a bit of in the past few years. We follow Deacon St. John, badass biker and zombie expert, or rather freaker expert, after spending roughly 2 years in monster infested Oregon, or as people in game refer to that, 2 years out in the shit. With the E3 trailer all the way back from 2016 providing most people with their general idea of what this game is, Days Gone had already set the bar quite high for itself, with players expecting a zombie experience cranked up to 11. And let's begin by attacking it from that angle. What can you expect from Days Gone? This thing comes with all your standard open world game elements. A series of main quests making for a 25 to 30 hour long campaign roughly, and several optional objectives plus side missions, all in a surprisingly interesting world for the player to explore. The best way I can describe the feeling I get from Days Gone is a Far Cry style world featuring Uncharted-like controls in a Last of Us and Walking Dead inspired setting. If those things I just mentioned are all things you're into, I can almost guarantee you'll enjoy this game overall. I say overall because there were some hiccups along the way, and I'll get to those in a bit. For now, let's get into gameplay specifics of what Days Gone has to offer. Once you get out of the introductory missions, the game really starts to make a lot of sense. You're gonna hear me say this a lot, because getting away from the first camp and riding out into the open world made me feel like I was playing a completely different game. At first, I just enjoyed my surroundings and the mood that the weather, freakers and nature combined create. I decided I wanted to get to one of the first main missions and had a look at my map of where I needed to go. First thing I did was check if fast travel was on the menu or would maybe be grayed out since I just started the game, just because I was curious, and to my surprise it was actually there, but when selected you're told that there are infested areas along the route to the destination, and if you want to fast travel you need to clear this area out. Cool, something worthwhile to do that makes sense for the gameplay mechanic. I headed over there, cleared out the checkpoint and freaker nests around the place, and after getting past various obstacles, I was rewarded with a permanent stat upgrade with one of these injectors you can find around the map. So I had a personal goal with my initial trip, I completed the objective to reach it, was presented with interesting gameplay options along the way, and even rewarded at the end of it. That's just really solid open world gameplay design right there. Instead of throwing out area radar beacons and generic enemy strongholds to tick items of a design checklist, Days Gone does a consistently good job at placing well thought out objectives that make sense around the world. Things started to click at this point, and as I kept playing I bumped into lone survivors stuck in cars overwhelmed by freakers, other surviving factions setting up ambushes along the roads, all contributing to this pool of gameplay opportunities that make sense. These objectives will sometimes challenge you. Some of these can be genuinely difficult, and dealing with a horde is not something you'll be ready for until you're a bit into the game and experienced with your surroundings. You could probably tell from most of the gameplay so far, this game is mostly about shooting zombies, so let's talk about that more in detail. Combat. Days Gone applies some of the most standard open world combat tools and tricks. The third-person shooting experience itself feels somewhat polished, with shoulder swapping and controls allowing for various levels of assisted aiming if that's your sort of thing. The gun sounds are strong and satisfying, at least for the most part, and there's enough gore to go around. But there's nothing there you haven't really seen before. You have 3 different skill tree-like features that allows your characters to improve in certain areas as you go through the game. I'm definitely on board with 2 of 3 skill trees, but there's one, the survival tree, that I didn't quite ever spec into, and it just never really felt worth it. Could definitely have been one of those things for just me and my playthrough, but I couldn't help but notice I finished the game with maybe 1 or 2 points put into it. You're also offered a decent selection of firearms throughout the game, but just like the skill tree, most things are unlocked as you progress. In addition to more standard firearms, there are also consumables and throwables of all sorts. Molotovs are key to many objectives in the game, and I assume it's for that reason you can craft these on the fly. No crafting bench needed. If you have the materials, you can make it then and there. Finding the materials themselves is not too much of a pain in the ass either, but I wouldn't say this game gives you an overwhelming amount of resources. If you want to find specific resources, there are certain designated spots, like cop cars for ammo, ambulances for medkits, and various shops and buildings for most other items. This aspect of the game very much continues in the same vein as the previous one, in that it's easy to wrap your head around and it makes a lot of sense. To get your hands on better guns or bike upgrades, you can complete missions for rewards, hand in resources, or bounties from your travels. When you're out in the wild, you can carve up animals and hand in the meat to a camp kitchen. They accept a range of things you can find and hunt out in the wild. If you've recently slaughtered a good amount of infected monsters as well, you can hand in various monster ears at the bounties NPC for camp credits. These are just like you'd expect, camp specific, and can be used for unlocks around the camp, with certain more powerful weapons and items locked until the camp trusts you enough to sell them to you. Whilst all systems we've seen in other games, these are implemented with simplicity and usability in mind, and I feel like you can kind of appreciate that. All of this is very approachable, easy to pick up and play gameplay with few complexities to it. But let's get back to talking about those hiccups and issues I've experienced along the way. Beginning with the game's intro, like most open world games, there's an introductory sequence of objectives to set the scene, teach you the basic controls, and give your character's situation context. This in itself isn't the bad part, but it's here just a couple of minutes into the game where you're introduced to how Days Gone handles cutscenes. They're all in-game cinematics rendered in real time with very well implemented mocap, and this sounds great on paper, but in practice, it's another story. There will be these really good looking gameplay sequences abruptly interrupted by a loading screen before you get to watch the cinematic that follows. The actual cinematic looks great, but then again, you're hit with a loading screen just after you're done watching too. Sometimes these cutscenes are also placed into the middle of longer gameplay sequences where normally a shorter scripted event would have been better. God of War did this very well, and it creates a smooth gameplay experience that still allows for narrative and scripted events to be sprinkled in between the playable parts, when done right at least. Days Gone instead has this kinda choppy feel of gameplay, loading, cutscene, loading, gameplay, loading, cutscene, loading. You get the picture. This isn't always a problem, but in some main story missions, and especially in the first couple hours, it does become disruptive. From what I could figure out, at least, this appears to be related to this next issue that at least I experienced quite a bit of, which has to do with world rendering. The one consistency I could notice between the varying lengths of loading screen of about 5 to 30 seconds was this. Loading time seems to depend on how much of the world you can see in the background in these cutscenes. If the cinematic takes place in a room with no windows and only 2 characters, there's barely any loading, closer to a quick fade to black. However, if you're outside with a lot of the world visible and many characters on screen, loading times can get a bit longer, and I even had a couple of times where the world in the cutscene didn't load in properly and I was left with characters just floating in thin air and such. That last thing I mentioned only happened once or twice, but I think I also had a crash related to that. This does also line up with the experience I had in the gameplay part of the game too. When you travel around the world on the back of your motorcycle, there are very few hiccups in gameplay, mechanics, or even visuals for the most part. However, as you go through the game and you're able to start maxing out your means of transportation to go faster, I started noticing some issues with performance. Sometimes I'd be going so fast I'd be dropping a significant amount of frames per second, making the entire experience quite a bit less enjoyable, and at other times I wouldn't get as much lag from the world not rendering fast enough, but rather just various textures or 3D models staying low quality due to not updating quick enough. The LOD, or level of detail systems in Days Gone that are meant to handle this, are so crucial for a good open world experience, and my experience was far from flawless here. Some of these issues have been mentioned in the information I got from PlayStation to be fixed in the Day 1 patch, but I can't tell you how the entire game runs now since I finished it nearly a week ago. The Day 1 patch is also yet another download, and for some potentially a very slow one. So both of these things, mostly the load times for cutscenes at the start though, meant my absolute first impression of Days Gone was already leaning towards the negative side. The world was cool and the premise alright, but this start wasn't just rough. When put next to the rest of the actual game I described earlier, it's just flat out bad. At first I thought maybe my issue had something to do with the initial enormous minimum 67 gigs of a background download you can run as you play the start of the game, but it really is just a very cutscene tight and gameplay lacking introduction that had some rough edges, to say the least. Once you get over the initial bump in the road, the rich world of Days Gone is easy to enjoy and can keep you occupied for hours on end. The concept is not groundbreaking, but it's executed with intent and purpose, featuring gameplay integrated well enough with its post-apocalyptic setting to make it a special experience. A third-person open-world zombie game is almost as generic as game ideas come. However, this game manages to take that concept just a little bit further. Take dynamic weather directly affecting gameplay is the sort of thing we've seen thrown around in marketing for years, but despite that, this is one of the few games where I felt like it was genuinely true. In the rain, it might be easier to sneak around undetected, but driving your bike around on a muddy trail kinda sucks, and that's exactly the feeling you should get from that situation. When the weather clears up, you do also kinda appreciate it. Moving on from gameplay and world design, let's finish this review off by talking story. As per usual for my reviews, I keep as far away from spoilers as possible, but I want people to know what they can expect. With The Last of Us and The Walking Dead bringing gamers some of the most beloved characters and storylines to date, the bar for this type of universe is already set quite high. To go back to the in-game cinematics mentioned earlier, I really meant it when I said they look great. The mocap animation for the characters felt like it stood out as particularly good at times, and the lighting plus world design is there to back it up. The tools for storytelling are all here, and Days Gone does have a main plot that takes a few turns and develops as you go through the game. I wish I could say I really enjoyed the overall idea of the story, but that's exactly where this game fell a bit short for me. The plot didn't leave me with a lasting impression, which might sound surprising when there's already been mentions in the press about an interest from Sony in making Days Gone a lasting franchise. I think that part though comes from the character development, as getting to know Deacon St. John, his close friends, later allies and enemies is actually interesting. The blanks are filled in as time goes on, and some pretty decent dialogue is paired with even better voice acting that I enjoyed listening to during long rides on the back of my bike. But I have to say, I really liked some of the characters that I met on my journey, but damn, can the plot be cheesy and just disappointing at times. So in that regard, it's just like the rest of Days Gone, really. Not a revolutionary experience, but an enjoyable ride with purposeful events along the way.